Hey everyone, about to get started. Right now we have Jacinda Shelly from But Why is the Django Admin Slow?
Hello, thank you all for coming. We'll get through this together. I know it is post-lunchtime and it's already been a day and a half of talks, so I appreciate you all being here. I know even though I've given several talks, I still had 2 nightmares last night about accidentally taking a flight home and missing my own talk, which was just wonderfully reassuring to wake up to in the morning. Today we're going to be talking about why your Django admin might not be performing at its best. And there are a few basic reasons that I've come across that are good places to start. This is certainly not the be-all and end-all in terms of admin performance talks, but it's a few quick things that you can check. A little bit about me before we get started. I'm currently the CTO at Doctor On Demand. I was the first engineer and employee there. We use Python and Django. We have a booth. We're hiring. Part of the reason that I started becoming interested in this topic was because of issues that I had personally. And outside of work, I like exercise, reading, family time. And I would like to say a big thank you to PyCon for making childcare available at the conference, without which this talk would have been a lot more difficult for me to give. This is me dropping my daughter off earlier today. And this is her 3rd PyCon. She's 2.5, so PyCon is a very family-friendly conference. All right, let's get started. You just started using the admin. First, you feel like this. I wrote 1 line of code, and I have a whole site. This is amazing. Everyone thinks that I am a programming god. You didn't mention that this was a built-in feature of Django. That would just give you a week of extra work. People start using it, they think you're a miracle worker, you love Django. They start requesting new features, you add them with just 1 or 2 lines of code, everything is going smoothly, you feel like this. This goes on for a little while. You're flying, how? The Django admin. But then, come on, my grandma goes faster than this through peanut butter. You start hitting 5-second load times, 10-second load times, 30-second load times. People are complaining. You didn't change any of the code. You're not really sure why this is happening. And now, your boss, team, client, you're trying to convince them it's okay. But they're like, no, this needs to be faster. You're feeling down because you're thinking, man, I'm going to have to redo all of this functionality from scratch. It's going to delay things. I'm not going to work on that new feature that I wanted to work on. And everyone is just going to be upset. So, what do you do instead? In this talk, we're going to use an example library application. This is an example that I use frequently because it's relatively easy to understand, and there are a lot of relationships in this database. Books have authors, library users check out books, they have due dates. Also, I've used it many times in the past, and I'm lazy, and I didn't want to rewrite code for another example. Our library allows users to update and manage the items in the library's collection, to view which items are checked out by users and when they are due, and whether they are overdue. So in the admin at the top, you can see the built-in groups. We have library users, which are our patrons and our librarians. And then within the Stacks app, we have authors, books, and books that are loaned out, which is a relationship between the library user and a particular book. Look at some of the code First, we have our custom library user model, which inherits from abstract user. For most of the code examples in this presentation, there are more comments in the actual code, which I will provide a link to at the end. But for the purposes of making the text as large as possible for the presentation, I left out a lot of the comments. The boilerplate user has our username, first name, last name, email address, whether or not they're allowed to use the admin, and other basic information. To this, we also added birth date, gender, and which books the user has checked out. We added a friendly string method, dunderstr, to get the user's full name. The next model that we have is the author of a book. In this, we are only including last name and first name for simplicity. Finally, we have a book which inherits from an abstract item, which most of the fields in the abstract item are not relevant to this talk, so I left those out. A book has a title, a page count, the daily fine, which will increase the longer you have an overdue book. I actually have one that's overdue right now, and I found that I can't renew it online, so I'm having minor anxiety about this at the moment. Finally, we have our loaned book model, which is a relationship between a patron who has checked out a book, a particular book. It has a checkout date, a due date, the date that the book was returned, if applicable, how many times it was renewed, and whether or not they paid a fine. Our helpful output here is that we join the string representation of the patron and the string representation of the book together. Next, one of the most important tools that we will use in this presentation is called the Django-debug-toolbar. If you are new to Django and learn nothing else from this presentation, it is that this is one of the most useful tools that you can download. It gives you information into, for example, what version of Django you're using, how long it took for your page to load, what settings you're using, headers, the request. What we'll spend all of our time on in this talk is the SQL output. But there are so many levels of the debug toolbar that are useful that it's worth your time to check this out and read through the full documentation. Installation is as simple as adding it to our installed apps, our middleware, and a quick tip is that internal IPs, this is something that I think trips a lot of people up. It's a whitelist of IPs that are making requests to your server. If you're doing local development, this is typically 127.0.0.1. But places that this can trip people up is, for example, if you're doing development on a virtual machine, then you want internal IPs to be whatever the virtual machine sees as your host. Because otherwise, you won't see the debug toolbar. It will take you a long time to figure it out, and you will be sad. Also, if you are running the debug toolbar on a development server that is, for example, behind a VPN, and you're connecting to it from your own machine, then it needs to be the IP address of your machine that is in internal IPs. This is one of the most common configuration issues I see with people using the debug toolbar in non-local development. All right, let's get, this is our first attempt. We created a simple list view for loaned book. All we did was register it with the admin. And so it's using the default dunderstr method that we had for loaned book. And it's taking 17 milliseconds to load. Even though this is local, it should be much, much faster than that. And it's doing 205 queries to the database for one page. You can imagine that if you had a very large database, this would take even longer. Also, why would you need to do 205 queries for this? You notice that by default, the list view has 100 views. So we think 200, 100, there's probably something O(in) going on here. So this is a little hard to see. Let's blow it up. We won't be able to blow it up, my apologies. The first few SQL queries that are being run here are grabbing the library user and the loan book for every single item in the list. But why? Remember, this was what we were doing without anything custom. First, we get all of the loaned book entries, which is one query. That's fine. Then we get all of our related objects, one by one by one. One of the very helpful things about the django-debug-toolbar is it tells you that there are 101 similar queries going on for this. That's a big red flag. All right, so we know. Now we can figure out what the culprit is. Debug toolbar also gives us a wonderful traceback where we can see that on every single query, we're calling that dunder-stir method. Let's dig a little bit deeper. What did that method look like? We created a friendly method, but Django's admin doesn't know how to do advanced code introspection to figure out, hey, they're calling this every time I evaluate the dunder-stir method. Maybe I should optimize my query. That's a challenging problem to solve. But there are ways that we can tell the admin that we're doing this. First solution is to use a list display. And we'll go through each of these solutions in detail and why they work. If we use a list display that explicitly breaks these out into columns, instead of using the dunder-stir method for loaned book, which Django has to evaluate each time, the query will deliberately grab patron and book separately and just use the dunder-stir method on those, which isn't calling any related objects, and that will optimize that page. It also looks a little bit nicer. There are reasons you might not be able to do this in real life, so there are a couple of other solutions. One is to use list select related equals true. This is a hit it with a hammer type solution. The other possibility is to be more specific because list select related supports iterables. So you can say, I deliberately want to select patron and book. Let's walk through what happens when we use these. So you can see this is solution 1. And hooray, we had a 15x speed up. So it went from around 17 milliseconds to just over 1 millisecond. The view is much more friendly because now we're seeing patron and book separately. And we went from 205 queries to 5. There are ways we could reduce that even more that I'll mention at the end. But those are the default 5 queries that Django will run for any list view. Now let's try the second solution that was called hitting it with a hammer. In this particular example, displaying in 2 columns is a really nice way for the user to view it, but that may not always be possible in other circumstances. So what happens if we do list select related equal true? Also 5 queries. Let's go home. But say we had, instead of 2 foreign keys on this model, 20. List select related is going to do a join on all 20 of those, and you will still be very unhappy. So being more specific, we can say list select related is patron. And the reason that I started with just saying patron is so you can see the example of what happens when you're more specific, because this can be a double-edged sword. If you use list select related equal true, it will always grab all of the related objects. If you use list select related as an iterable, and you forget one of your related fields, or someone adds another column later, and you don't update list select related, then you'll go from your nice optimized page to, again, in queries because you forgot to add something to your iterable. So we have 105 queries now. We can see what the SQL debug section looks like. At the top, we are grabbing all of the users, but we're still going through every single book. So the full solution include both items. Look at the SQL. We're back down to 5 queries. But another thing to note that I'll highlight here is that Django is getting all of the fields on every model, even though we're really only using title, first name, and last name of our users. In many cases, this is reasonable behavior. It's not so concerning to grab all of the columns in your table, but sometimes it is, especially if you have a lot of columns in your table, or you have columns that are particularly large. So if you have columns that have a lot of text in them, or just a lot of data, it's going to take a lot of time just to pull those up. Now, there are ways that you can get the admin to not grab so many fields. So let's talk through how that works. The admin supports the ability for you to create a custom query set. This overrides the default getQuerySet method on the admin. So you add a getQuerySet method. Remember to call the built-in method of the superclass. Then you add to the query set .only, which tells the ORM that you only want to grab these specific columns. In this case, we're grabbing patron first name, patron last name, and the daily fine on the book. And then remember to return the query set, because if you don't remember to return the query set, you will get an unfortunate error that last time I checked was not particularly descriptive, and you will scratch your head being like, what did I do? So remember to return your query sets so that Django will know what to display. Use this with caution again, because in this example, I made a little bit of a mistake. I have 105 queries still. What are they? I'm grabbing daily fine, but I'm using title. So if I add the wrong column, or again, like in our list select related example, you come along later and you change the display of the admin, but you forget to update your query set, you can have a bad time. We fix it to display book title instead. And we can see what happens here is we have some speed up from the 5 queries earlier. It's actually below 1 millisecond on my local system now. So even on my little system, this is faster. It's negligible, but if you have hefty columns, and I've seen this in practice, this can give you some considerable speed ups. Now let's try something else. This is getting into the slightly more complicated world where we have a book with multiple authors. We want to show all of the authors in the list view. So what we do is we define a callable for displaying the authors, in this case, our def authors display, which returns a list of all of the authors and turns it into a string, my apologies. We add this callable into admin list display, and we set list select related to true because we learned our lesson last time. It works, but we have 105 queries. Why? For every book, we're now doing a query to get all of the authors, which is not what we wanted. So the reason this happens is because select related is for foreign key relationships, but it doesn't work for reverse foreign key relationships. So here we're going from the book to the author when the relationship is the other way. The answer to this is to use prefetch related instead. But this isn't one of the default built-ins. You can't just say list prefetch related equal true and be on your merry way. Instead, you have to go back to our friend, the custom query set. In this case, we do the same thing where we call the default query set on the superclass, and we add prefetch related on authors. We're down to 6 queries. And just for your information, this is the actual query that the ORM generates. You can see it manually puts in all of the IDs for the author's book ID that it needs to fetch. And our final example is on how you might optimize the SQL for if you're counting, say, for the author's display. So here we have our author admin, and we want to display how many books each author has written in our library. This is what our author admin looks like. On the left, we have the name of the author. On the right, we have the count of the books. And 105 queries again, 1 count query for each row. We don't have any foreign key relationships to help us out, but we can use annotate. So again, we create a custom query set. We add query set.annotate, which we use book count to add that to our query. And then in list display, we can reference that annotation. And now the admin knows to just create 1 query, which looks like this, where it does a left outer join on stacks book authors, and you get a single query to do all of that work for you. And you can see there the count as book count. Finally, I'll close out with a few other tips. Say that you don't have time to fix everything. One of the other, this is not typically a great long-term solution, but one of the things you can do quickly is to decrease the list per page, because n times 100 versus n times 10 will make a difference to your database. You can set show full result count to false. One of the things on that 5 standard queries that were being presented was a count at the very bottom, where it's just counting all of the rows in your database. If you have a lot of rows, all the rows in your table. If you have a lot of rows in your table, then this can be slow. You can use a custom paginator. We're not going to get into that, but the other count query that Django does is to create pagination on your list view. And finally, sorting can be expensive. So if you're doing sorting, there are a couple different ways that you can optimize that so that it doesn't affect your admin. But those are all things to look at if the tips here for your database aren't getting you far enough. And thank you for attending. All of the code for this talk can be found on GitHub under my account. You can reach me on Twitter at Jacinda Shelly. And obligatory, Doctor On Demand is hiring. We have a booth here. We'll be at the job fair. We have lots of people who can talk to you about the company, so stop by and say hi. I promise we are all very friendly. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacinda. We have a few minutes for questions now, so if you do have a question, you can approach the audience mics there and there.
Hi, Ferris.
Jacinda. Hey, how's it going?
Good.
My question for you, and perhaps I missed the first part of the talk a little bit, was how do you go about profiling on a production versus a development environment to find, you get these n+1 queries and all kinds of issues that you would only see when you're getting that much traffic? Do you have any advice about that?
I do. All of the examples here happen as your database size increases. So there are 2 things that I found you can do. For this, I created a script to generate a large amount of test data. So you can do that in your own local environment. If you're still not replicating the issue, be very, very careful with this approach. But if you have a staging environment that has the same data, depending on how regulated your data is, you may be able to have a copy of that locally. We can't do that at Doctor On Demand. One approach that I recommend as an absolute last resort is to put an environment that looks similar behind a VPN. You can also be behind that same VPN and only allow traffic from that VPN. And in that case, you can put on the debug toolbar. I say use that approach with a lot of caution because it is very easy to get wrong and very easy to expose production database because you do have to have debug set to true for the debug toolbar to work.
Thank you.
Yes?
Hi. I was wondering if you've had any specific problems with Django admin being slow on detail pages and wanting to do different query sets on the list view and the detail view. For example, using like inlines or even Django nested admin.
Yes, you can. The same approach essentially applies where you would modify the get query set method for those specific views. And I would have to review the documentation to figure out exactly where to put that in, but it is possible to do that.
Okay, thanks.
I think that's all the questions we had. I'm also happy to take questions out in the hall afterwards. Thank you again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your PyCon.